Me and Lucas decided to take a weekend off to disconnect from the city and explore the countryside. We got in the car and set off, excited to reconnect with nature. The winding, deserted road seemed perfect until our car started sputtering. "We need to stop before the car breaks down completely," Lucas said, worried. I agreed, looking back, trying to find any sign of civilization. The road seemed to stretch infinitely into the darkness, with no other vehicles in sight. We spotted a rusty sign that read, "Umbral Inn." It seemed like our only option. The inn looked old and abandoned, but desperation drove us to enter. A bell rang as we opened the door, and an elderly man with tired eyes and a forced smile greeted us. "Welcome. Just passing through?" the man asked, grabbing a key from the board behind him. "Our car broke down. Can we stay the night?" I replied, trying to hide my discomfort. Of course. We have a room available. Follow me," the old man said, walking slowly down a dimly lit corridor. The atmosphere was claustrophobic, with the smell of mold and dust in the air. The room was small and simple, with old furniture and a sense of abandonment. A strange chill ran down my spine as I looked around. The discomfort was palpable, but we were exhausted and decided to lie down. During the night, I woke up to a soft whisper, almost imperceptible. "Lucas, did you hear that?" But Lucas was sound asleep. The whisper continued, louder this time, and it seemed to come from within the walls. Scared, I got out of bed and went to the window. The rain was beating hard, and the wind howled like a lament. Suddenly I saw a shadowy figure in the inn's courtyard, looking directly at me. Before I could scream, the figure disappeared. I went back to bed and shook Lucas, who finally woke up. "There's someone outside." I saw a strange figure in the courtyard. Lucas, still groggy, tried to calm me down. "It must be your imagination. Let's go back to sleep. We'll deal with it tomorrow." But I knew something was wrong. The whispers intensified, turning into high-pitched screams that echoed through the room. Terror gripped me, and Lucas and I ran down the corridor, trying to find an exit. The lights flickered, and shadows moved on the walls as if they were alive. We reached the lobby and saw the old man from the reception standing there, with a vacant look and a sinister smile. "Welcome to the Umbral. Here the living and the dead coexist, and you will never leave." Desperate, we ran to the door, but it was locked. The screams were now coming from all directions, and the shadows surrounded us. Lucas tried to force the door, but something invisible pulled him back, dragging him into the darkness. I screamed, trying to hold on to Lucas, but it was useless. He was swallowed by the shadows. Feeling helpless, I fell to my knees, crying. "Please let us go," I begged, but silence was the only response. Suddenly the door creaked open. Trembling, I stood up and ran outside without looking back. The cold rain drenched me instantly, but I didn't care. I ran until I found an old gas station where an attendant helped me and called the police. When the police arrived at the inn, they found nothing but a ruined building with no sign of life. Lucas disappeared without a trace, and I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, unable to forget the horrors of the Umbral. In the days that followed, I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They said it was all a delusion caused by stress, but I knew it was real. I saw the shadows. I heard the screams. One night in the hospital, I woke up again to whispers. I looked around the dark room and saw a familiar figure. It was Lucas, or at least something that looked like him. "You shouldn't have left," he said, with a voice that wasn't his. I jumped out of bed and ran down the hospital corridor, but the lights flickered and shadows moved on the walls, just like in the inn. I was back in the Umbral, and this time there was no way out. I tried to scream for help, but no sound came out. The shadows surrounded me, and I felt a terrifying cold take over my body. Lucas, or whatever that thing was, approached, his smile distorted and eyes empty. "Welcome back," he said. "Now, you'll stay here forever." Terror paralyzed me, and the shadows enveloped me. I felt myself being pulled into the darkness, to a place where the living don't belong. The last thing I saw was Lucas's face transforming into something horrible before everything went black. To this day, they say the Umbral Inn only appears to those who are destined never to be seen again, sucking their souls forever into the realm of shadows. I'm just one of the many victims who never escaped. And now, I'm part of the Umbral, waiting for the next lost soul to cross its doors. Since I was dragged into the darkness, I've realized that my existence has become an eternal vigil, a specter condemned to wander the corridors of the Umbral. I see other lost souls, all trapped in this limbo, reliving their worst nightmares repeatedly. One night I saw a young couple arrive at the inn. They looked happy, unaware of the fate that awaited them. I tried to warn them, but my screams were just inaudible whispers to the living. They too met the old receptionist, who led them to the room, just as he had done with me and Lucas. The cycle repeated, the whispers, the screams, the shadows. I watched helplessly as they were consumed by terror. With each new victim, the Umbral grew stronger, increasing in power and malevolence, and I, an eternal witness, felt guilt gnawing at my soul. As time passed, I began to understand the secrets of the Umbral. I discovered that the old receptionist was not a mere human, but an ancient entity, a guardian of the shadows, tasked with luring souls into this eternal hell. He fed off the fear and despair of the guests, using their energies to keep the Umbral alive. I realized I wasn't alone in my condemnation. Other spirits like me tried to warn the unsuspecting, but we were powerless against the guardian's strength. The Umbral kept us prisoners, and any attempt to communicate with the world of the living was smothered. On a particularly dark night, I saw a young woman arrive at the inn. She had an air of determination and seemed less vulnerable than the other victims. I felt a connection with her, as if there was a chance to break this cycle. I followed her down the corridor, watching every move. When the whispers began, I saw fear in her eyes, but also courage. She didn't let terror paralyze her. Instead, she started investigating the source of the whispers, something no one had done before. She found an old diary hidden in a secret compartment in the wall. The diary belonged to a woman who had stayed at the inn many years ago and documented her experiences with the shadows. The last entry spoke of a way to defeat the guardian. The young woman, whose name was Maria, read the diary carefully and decided to confront the guardian. Using the information from the diary, she prepared a ritual to banish the entity and free the souls trapped in the Umbral. I watched her with hope, praying that she would succeed. Maria drew ancient symbols on the lobby floor and began chanting words in a forgotten language. The guardian appeared, furious, trying to stop her. The shadows roared around her, but Maria stood firm. The ritual culminated in a direct confrontation between Maria and the guardian. The shadows roared, but the light emanating from the symbols on the floor began to dispel them. The guardian screamed in agony as his form disintegrated, and the souls trapped in the Umbral began to be freed. I felt a pull, like an invisible chain was loosening from me. The shadows around me dissipated, and I realized I was free. Maria had succeeded, the Umbral was collapsing, and the trapped souls were finally finding peace. When the guardian was destroyed, the Umbral Inn vanished as if it had never existed. Maria fainted from exhaustion but was found by local residents who took her to a hospital. She was the only survivor who managed to escape the Umbral and bring her story back to the living world. As for me, I found the peace I had longed for. My soul, along with the others, was released to move on, leaving behind the horrors of the Umbral. Although my story has ended, I know Maria will continue to fight against the forces of darkness, protecting the innocent from the horrors that lurk in the shadows. And so, the legend of the Umbral Inn became just a dark memory, a story told to scare travelers who ventured down deserted roads. But for those who lived its horrors, the memory never completely fades, haunting their nights with whispers and shadows from the past. I've always been a curious person, fascinated by the mysteries of the human mind. As a psychologist, I've had the opportunity to explore the deepest, darkest corners of my patients' psyches. But nothing could have prepared me for Clara's case. Clara was an attractive young woman in her 20s, with long black hair and eyes that seemed to pierce the soul of anyone who looked into them. She came to my office with a singular problem, an insatiable sexual compulsion that affected every aspect of her life. Clara was a nymphomaniac. From the beginning, something about her disturbed me. It wasn't just her condition, but the intensity with which she spoke of her desires and experiences. Her accounts were full of vivid, almost palpable details. As the sessions progressed, I began to feel a strange attraction to her, an invisible force pulling me closer. Clara spoke of a place she visited in her dreams, a place she called the Threshold. She described it as a vast void, a dimension where the deepest, darkest desires manifested in grotesque ways. She said that in this threshold, formless beings would come to her, satisfying her desires in ways the real world never could. At first, I thought it was just a manifestation of her disturbed mind, but the more Clara spoke, the more I began to believe there was something real about that place. She described sensations that were impossible to invent, experiences that left me chilled. During our sessions, Clara frequently went into graphic details about her sexual experiences, both in the real world and in the Threshold. She spoke of how the shadowy figures touched her in ways that transcended physical pleasure, creating an ecstasy that bordered on unbearable. Each account was more intense than the last, and I began to realize that Clara was not just a patient to me. She was becoming an obsession. One night, after a particularly intense session, Clara left me with a warning. "Be careful with the threshold," she said, her eyes fixed on mine. "Once you enter, you'll never be the same." I should have taken her warning seriously. I should have ended the case right then. But my curiosity, my need to understand what Clara was experiencing, led me to do something reckless. I began to study the threshold, looking for ways to access this dimension of dark desires. I spent sleepless nights reading ancient manuscripts and esoteric texts that spoke of parallel dimensions and summoning rituals. I found an old grimoire that mentioned the threshold and the steps needed to access it. The idea of exploring that dimension fascinated and terrified me at the same time. It was during one of these research sessions that I found an ancient manuscript. It spoke of a ritual that allowed one to enter the threshold, a series of steps that, if followed correctly, could open a portal to that dimension. Against my better judgment, I decided to try it. That night, in my apartment, I followed the manuscript's instructions. I lit black candles, drew symbols on the floor, and recited the ancient words. At first, nothing happened. But then, a cold sensation began to invade the room, and the air seemed to vibrate. Suddenly, I was in a completely different place. A vast void, just as Clara had described. I looked around, expecting to see the faceless forms from her dreams. Instead, I saw Clara. She was naked, floating in the void, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me shiver. "Welcome to the threshold," she said, her voice echoing around me. "I warned you to be careful." Before I could respond, I felt invisible hands grabbing me. An intense pleasure invaded my body, something beyond anything I had ever experienced. But there was something wrong, something deeply disturbing. The hands were cold, inhuman, and the pleasure I felt was tinged with a darkness that seemed to consume my soul. I tried to fight, but it was useless. The power of the threshold was overwhelming. Clara approached, her eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "Here, desires are all that matter," she said. "You're no longer an observer. Now you're part of the threshold." I was consumed by sensations that defied sanity. Every touch, every caress was a mix of pleasure and pain, a macabre dance between desire and terror. I lost track of time, trapped in that dimension where desires were insatiable monsters. When I finally woke up, I was back in my apartment, but something inside me had changed. I felt marked, a part of me still trapped in that place. Clara disappeared after that night, and I never saw her again. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I feel the cold of the threshold and hear Clara's voice whispering. Desire is no longer a pleasure but a curse I carry knowing that one day the threshold will call me back. And when that happens, there will be no escape. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. I tried to focus on my work, on my patience, but the image of the threshold and the sensations I experienced there never left me. I started having nightmares, vivid dreams where I was pulled back into that dark void. During a session, a patient asked if I was okay. "You look tired, doctor," she said. "Are you sure everything is all right?" I tried to smile and assure her that I was fine, but the truth was I was falling apart. I began to avoid mirrors. Whenever I looked at my reflection, I saw something different. My eyes seemed darker, deeper, as if a shadow was growing inside me. I started to feel a constant presence, a sense that something or someone was always watching. One night I woke up with the feeling of being watched. I looked around the room, trying to find the source of that sensation. It was then that I saw Clara, standing at the door, naked and with a disturbing smile on her face. "You thought you could escape the threshold?" she whispered. "It is a part of you now." I jumped out of bed, trying to turn on the light, but nothing happened. The room was plunged into darkness, and Clara's presence seemed to fill every corner. I felt her gaze burning into me, and a paralyzing fear took hold. "This is all your fault," I shouted, but my voice sounded weak, almost unrecognizable. "You dragged me into this." Clara just laughed, a cold, emotionless sound. "You came on your own. The threshold only responds to your deepest desires." At that moment, I understood the truth. My curiosity, my desire to understand Clara and the threshold, had been my downfall. I was the one who opened the door to that dimension, and now it couldn't be closed. The weeks passed, and the line between reality and the threshold began to blur. During the day, I tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy, but at night, the threshold called me back. I started feeling the invisible touches, even when I was awake, and the dark pleasure they brought was becoming harder to resist. I decided to seek help. I told my story to a trusted colleague, an experienced psychiatrist. He listened patiently, but in the end, he suggested that I take a leave of absence and seek treatment for what he believed to be a nervous breakdown. I followed his advice, but I knew that no conventional treatment could help me. I needed to find a way to break my connection to the threshold, to seal the portal I had opened. I returned to the ancient manuscripts, desperate for a solution. It was then that I found a passage that spoke of a way to banish the shadows of the threshold, a ritual that required a sacrifice, a price to be paid to restore balance. I knew it was risky, but I was willing to try anything. I prepared for the ritual, feeling a mix of hope and fear. I drew the symbols on the floor, lit the candles, and recited the ancient words. When I finished, a sense of calm filled the room. For a moment I believed it had worked. But then, the air turned cold, and Clara's presence appeared again. "You think you can rid yourself of the threshold?" she mocked. "It is a part of you now." I felt the invisible hands grabbing me again, but this time, the pleasure was replaced by excruciating pain. I screamed, falling to my knees, as the shadows of the threshold pulled me in. Clara approached, her smile fading. "There is no escape," she said, her voice now full of sorrow. "The threshold consumes the souls of those who dare enter. You are doomed to remain here forever." The pain intensified, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. The last thing I saw before succumbing was Clara's face, now showing an expression of regret. I felt a final pull, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, but something was different. The atmosphere felt colder, darker. I got up slowly, feeling every muscle in my body ache. I looked around and saw that the candles had melted, and the symbols on the floor looked burned. Trying to understand what had happened, I realized that the portal to the threshold was still open within me. From that moment on, my life became a constant nightmare. Every time I closed my eyes, I was dragged back to that terrifying void. I decided to find Clara, determined to learn more about the threshold and, if possible, find a way to break the connection. I went back to the office and searched through her records, discovering that she had been admitted to a psychiatric clinic right after our last session. I went to the clinic, willing to do anything to get answers. I found Clara in a small, sterile room, her eyes vacant, staring at nothing. When I approached, she slowly turned her head, and a faint smile appeared on her face.